Hey, so once again, welcome everyone. This is the last EpiSkills sessions for 2023, and we have an exciting topic today, an exciting set of experts who will be discussing this very intriguing topic. The topic for this evening is stigma, and without further ado, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Sloan Mahon, who is an associate professor in the history of medicine at the Oxford University. And the title that she'll be talking about is Ethnography, Oral History, and Stigmatized Conditions. So over to you, Dr. Sloan.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Edward. And thank you everybody for coming. And I'm really honored and pleased to be invited to participate today. First, I'm an unusual speaker, perhaps, for an ILAE webinar. I am a historian. I'm a historian of medicine and psychiatry and neurology. And I've worked mostly in African countries, but I'm working a little more broadly now. And I am also deeply engaged in the last several years in work on epilepsy and the lived experience of epilepsy, but specifically how oral history programs might contribute to tackling stigma for epilepsy, but other stigmatized conditions as well. So with 2 large grants, I actually run what we call an embedded oral history program. One is for the Epilepsy Innovation Pathway in Africa program, and we work in Ghana, Kenya, and Tanzania, and also the Oxford Martin School program on global epilepsy, which works in Africa, including Zimbabwe and Kenya and South Africa, but also Brazil and India. So we are taking quite a comparative look at what some of the commonalities are in people sharing their experiences and learning from each other, both as people who are engaged with global health, but also participants who are interested in sharing their stories with us in an oral history program. So I'm going to share my screen, that would help. And I think that should be coming up in a moment. Okay. And can everyone see that? I think that's probably okay. From beginning, here we go. So I'm going to talk from the point of view of a practitioner, but again, as a historian who is very interested in public health and very interested in community engagement. And so I'd like to talk about how the humanities, related to the social sciences, but how the humanities and a humanity discipline like history can contribute to a broader discussion about stigma and about lived experience of certain conditions. So oral history work is kind of all around us. And there are, from a historian's point of view, these collections are extremely important in their own right, just for historical documentation and in creating a body of work that historians might engage with, and documenting history so that we don't lose stories and we don't lose insights from people who are around now and people who've come before us. And so there's a wide range of types of oral history work that we might engage with. Sometimes these oral histories might be organized around a particular event, often a very difficult event. I have a section here on from Never Forget, an oral history of 9/11. We also have stories perhaps from particular regions that may represent people's stories and narratives from specific communities, like the study here on Goma. which is in the DRC. And then we also might have oral histories around professions. It could be sports teams, veterans, anything really, so that oral histories could be organized in a way that as a body of data or literature, we can start to kind of understand trends in history, but from a very, very intimate perspective. So engaging with global public health or community health is something that we'd be pretty familiar with in terms of qualitative research. And these are methodologies that many clinicians will be familiar with, and public health professionals will be familiar with. So we're quite used to survey data that might be appropriate for some studies. Focus groups are often a really good way to engage with broader communities and to get a kind of cross-section of perspectives. In-depth interviews or semi-structured interviews, they're often called, where kind of a more nuanced way, perhaps, or more detailed way to engage with survey data so that you have a series of questions that everybody would answer. And you have sort of a comparative sense of people's perspectives, maybe across the spectrum. But oral history and life histories are used less frequently. They're used, again, for historical research and often for public history or community history, but they're not used so much in public health or medicine or healthcare. And so one of my interests and interests of some of the colleagues that I have across some disciplines is how we might engage oral history work in an embedded way in larger medical or clinical research programs. And you'll hear a little bit more about lived experience, and increasingly we understand just how vital that is. So my perspective that I'm giving you is from the kind of methodological and discipline-oriented point of view, rather than the lived experience itself. But this is a way of maybe understanding how historians or how people working in public health might engage in a way that we start to understand lived experience, particularly when we're talking about something like stigma. And I'll get a little bit more into the issue of stigma in a moment. So the takeaway on this, oral history methodology, quite unusual for public health work or medical and clinical research. So this photograph is from members of the team and also our collaborating participants. On the far left is ILAE Masawe, and she was one of our key interviewers in Mahenge, Tanzania. And we're visiting Sixtus and his family. And he was very keen for us to kind of photograph him and film him and share his story. So he did a couple of interviews with ILAE. And it's really quite extraordinary, the kind of stories that come forward. And not only that, but the kind of relationships that can be built where participants in this process, they are not our patients, they are participants and collaborators, how they really engage and actually start to help us shape a program rather than being sort of people that we look at or talk about. This is much more a collaborative process where people's life histories become important and become in the forefront. So we aren't interested in simply giving people a questionnaire or saying, well, tell me all about your diagnosis. We want to know about your childhood. We want to know what it was like growing up where you did. We'd like to hear about family. The important thing about oral history is that it's driven by the participant themselves. So it's telling a story, but in the way that is meaningful to them. And so, of course, as an interviewer, we are guiding, we set the parameters of the kinds of things that we'll talk about. And so that's understood before the interview begins, but it's always a surprise in a sense to the interviewer, because you're listening to someone's life unfold as they start to remember things, as they realize what's important, as they remember a certain story that they want you to know about. And that's the important aspect of this, where you wouldn't be able to get that in a structured interview, or certainly not in a survey, or even a focus group, although all of these methods have their uses as well. So the two large grants that we have right now, and the programs that we have right now, started really, really small. And but that was a good thing, because we were actually engaging with a few communities, 3 communities in Zimbabwe. So we were in Harare, and then in a semi kind of urban environment, and then in quite a rural setting as well. And in each case, we had some community meetings where we talked about epilepsy. My colleague there in the front is Professor Arjun Sen, who is a neurologist at Oxford University. And Zimbabwe was quite an impactful, I would say, learning experience for both Arjun Sen and myself. And it really, these small meetings really kind of started us thinking about the power of people's stories. So I have on the side of the slide just kind of a number of sort of categories of things that came out in people's stories. So as a researcher, we might look at these categories and say, well, okay, what are we learning about childhood in ways that is kind of unique to people who are living with epilepsy, for instance, and what kinds of stories are coming out about their work life. How are they describing relationships? So as a body of data and research, although these answers are very, very kind of across the board, they may have real differences. There was also still a lot of commonality. And the kinds of stories that came out were not always intuitive, and these stories were not always, would not have been uncovered, let's say, in some of the literature that's out there. So what do we mean by stigma, for instance? Well, we had a situation recently. We had a meeting in Tanzania, and we were lucky enough to be visited by a couple of advocates, one in particular who is living with epilepsy. And again, just personal stories tell you so much more than kind of a more academic approach. I think we all know that. But I've been very long interested in the term stigma because it's used in such an umbrella way. So we think we know what stigma means, but people don't describe themselves as being stigmatized. I've talked to people, including this gentleman in Tanzania, where he would not say, I feel stigmatized. He'd say, I feel lonely. And he really talked about loneliness. And everyone who hears his story could immediately understand exactly where he's coming from, because people do feel lonely sometimes. Everyone has felt loneliness. And that kind of story is what will reach people and what will change minds about things, and what will inspire people to, I think, enact change and to work together. So early on, when we were looking at some of the literature around stigma, it really became apparent that we just didn't have the kinds of nuance and the kinds of expertise about what that meant from a lived experience. And so meetings like this one, where we talked about, the difficulties of cooking, for instance, where women felt their in-laws didn't want them cooking in the same space or with the same utensils as other members of the family. I mean, these were incredibly emotional stories that just really kind of taught us so much more than if we had done, many lit research, lit reviews and literature searches and studies. So these are the kinds of sort of meetings that inspired us to kind of think bigger about how many larger research grants might be lacking the lived experience approach and the expertise that comes with people who have this experience. I've just included here a quote that I like this quote because it's very simple. It's just very kind of clear. A young man says, "It can happen just like that. I just walk by myself like that, thinking I am in a safe place until that state subsides. I may be headed to the bus stop and find myself very far away, not where I had intended. Then I become aware, I was in that state. This is not where I was going." And again, it's not a dramatic statement, but when you hear it and you start thinking about perhaps putting yourself in that person's shoes, you think, well, what a frightening moment that this person is sharing. And they're only just telling us about their kind of daily life. And we're learning so much from what they have to tell us. Similarly, a woman age 48, also in Kenya, says, "When I fall down, those people are aware like yourself. When I have fallen, you will see me. But for me, when I fall down, I see a figure, not a person like you or me. It's the devil, that one. You see him clearly." Now, if I were reading clinical research, which might be very important research, and it speaks of hallucinations or hearing things or being disoriented, that is something I might be able to take on board as a researcher, but it doesn't in any way really teach me with the same type of impact, I think, as reading or hearing a statement like this. One of the other benefits that's really important and unusual about oral history work, of course, is that we listen to it, we hear it. So the projects that we have going, we have recorded audio in people's local languages or the languages they're most comfortable speaking in. So we can hear their voice, we can hear their emotion, we can hear how they wish to present themselves. And then on top of that, we will have a transcript in a local language also, and then an English translation. So what do we have here? This is the beginning of, we hope, a very large collection from multiple spots in the world, regions and countries, multiple languages, where we start to learn all the differences, what's important locally to some people, but also kind of quite a global reach of why a condition like epilepsy affects so many people in such severe ways. One of the unusual, I suppose, methods that we've employed in Rio is we actually have a neurologist doing the oral history work. Now, that's not something that we had planned. We initially assumed that our interviewers would be people who have some experience in qualitative research. They might work in public health or community health or community development, or they might be, say, a graduate student or a medical student in neuropsychology or neurology. But in the case of Rio, our collaborating neurologist, Maria Andraus, really wanted to do the oral histories herself. This was a bit risky because we make it very clear that the oral history work is not part of clinical care. It's not treatment. It is a way for us to learn and a way for us to make sure that people's voices are heard and people's perspectives are understood. So we keep that quite separate usually from the clinical engagement with a doctor. But in this case, Maria was quite insistent, quite interested in doing this work. And she has now done about 25 interviews. And she's also training a medical student who's very interested in this work. And we're finding it to be incredibly rewarding. She has found it rewarding herself. And she's been telling us that she feels she has changed the way that she listens. She has changed some of her kind of approach to practice. And I'm pleased to say some other neurologists who are, of course, excellent clinicians, have started to see some of the value in oral history work. And of course, in a clinical engagement, you don't have the time to sit with somebody for an hour and a half. But nonetheless, Maria has reported back to us that there has been just some kind of improved communication around the clinic, and some of the participants are indeed her actual patients. So they've had to have a dialogue about, well, this is separate from treatment. And yet her patients or these participants have come back and said, you know, no one's listened to me for this long. No one's really kind of engaged with me and asked me these sorts of questions and allowed me to just speak about my life in this way. So we're actually quite interested in what comes next, which is how are people who are participating in the interviews finding that experience? Has it been valuable to them? Has it been meaningful? Was it worth doing? And that's actually, I'll get to that in a minute. That's actually one of my kind of key interests right now moving forward. I'll just very quickly say something about, because we've had these sort of networks and these research projects in place, we've also been able to branch out a little bit and engage even more with the humanities. So this is a project where called Pioneers in African Neurology. It's a funded, very small grant from the Oxford Research Center in the Humanities. And this is simply to record first generation or kind of prominent African neurologists telling their story about how they came to neurology and why they were so fascinated to get into this line of work. So we've been doing these kind of short interviews with people in order to create a digital storytelling project. So more on that, I hope, in future. Now, this is my last slide, but really this is the kind of take-home message that I want to convey. So the individual who's pictured here, her name is Dr. Michelle Winslow, and she runs what is a pretty rare and innovative program of oral history working within a clinic in palliative and end-of-life care. And this is at the University of Sheffield. So Michelle Winslow has now created, sorry, it's my timer, has now created a program that works now in tandem with medical training in palliative care, so for junior doctors. And it's also a service that patients can be referred to. Obviously, it's voluntary, but many have found it to be really beneficial. In the case of a palliative care clinic, some participants who, having received a copy of their audio interview, have said, you know, this is so meaningful to me because now my grandchildren will hear my voice and they'll know what my voice sounded like. And they'll know my stories from my childhood when I was their age. So this is all kinds of sort of benefits might be surprising. And we're really kind of wondering, well, what could the possibilities be for engaging with oral history within healthcare settings? Is it beneficial? To whom? In what ways? Do people feel this is something that could enhance their experience when they're engaging with hospitals or with health centers? Does it add to a sense of well-being? Does it improve communication? Does it just feel good and feel like an important thing to participate in? So these are questions that we're going to be asking ongoing. So I'm going to leave it there. I think I'm out of time, but thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sloan, for a very fantastic talk. So, so please, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat box, and then we'll respond to the questions right at the end. So our next speakers, it's a family. We are privileged to have them talk this evening, is Mr. and Mrs. Labi. Mr. Labi is the president of the IBE Ghana chapter. And both Mr. and Mrs. Labi are epilepsy advocates. Mrs. Labi is a patient with epilepsy, and she has lived with epilepsy for 40 years. And Mr. and Mrs. Labi have been married for 16 years, and they've been blessed with 2 children. And they'll be sharing with us their experience of living with epilepsy in their family. So without further ado, please, Mr. and Mrs. Labi, you're welcome.
Unmute myself. You can hear me now?
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
Okay, so like I said, I will give my wife the opportunity to say a little before I come in to conclude.
Okay, thank you. I'm a person living with epilepsy. Since I was 6 years old, then it started, and up to now. And when it started like if I'm sleeping, then it will come. But along the line, it changed. Anytime, any day, it comes. So that time when I sleep and it comes, I get the opportunity to go to school. So after my secondary school, then the thing changed. Anytime, then it will come. So the strategy I have learned it myself is that if I'm closer to you, then I'll tell you my problem. So if it's happened, then you help me. So like when people fall on the streets or maybe cloud places, I have not experienced that one in my life. And I thank God that when I get this medication I'm on, now everything have changed. I'm better now. Thank you.
Okay, so yes, like Mrs. Labi said, it started from somewhere, and she has gotten to this point. And one of the things she was doing before to deal with the stigma, because we know anytime something or a person is stigmatized, it means that the person, he or she has a condition that people have so much misconception about, and they don't want to be associated with it. So they isolate themselves from such people. And that makes the patient feel more bitter, and they feel that life is not worth living. But for her, she was able to muster the courage and tell people, or those who are very close to her, this is my problem. So in that case, it helps to deal with a lot of the stigma issues, especially with people very, very close to her. And that is how she has dealt with it. But I remember before we got married, 2 years before we got married, I find out that she has epilepsy. And for my learning at that time, 16 years ago, I don't think I know much about epilepsy. I know little about epilepsy. So I had an opportunity to learn. And because I was ready to learn, I did. And with the help of Dr. Apalu, Professor J, Dr. Chawefeli, and the rest, I learned a lot of things that helped me to be able to deal with the issue and then help other people who are living with it. And as an advocate, speaking from the point of an advocate, there was so much stigma, which I observed from the time I started to go into this area and then see what I can do to help those who are living with the condition. Because for our statistics in Ghana, I just realized that we have over 280,000 persons who are living with it. And that was an alarming a number at that time. So that even pushed me to want to do more than caring for my wife, but for other people who probably don't have anyone to care for them or have little knowledge about what they are going through and it's affecting their life. Because I tell you, from the work I have done and my experience, stigma really affects persons who are living with epilepsy. And I have said that the stigma is even more difficult to deal with than the condition itself. Because ordinarily you feel that the condition should be the burden. But for me and the experiences I've had, I realized that the stigma is more of a burden than the condition. Because yes, because people have this wrong perception about this condition, they isolate themselves from persons who are living with epilepsy. They either don't want to drink with them in the same cup, they don't want to sit with them or sit close to them. They don't even want to play with them. Sometimes they don't even want their shadow to cross the person living with epilepsy shadow, because they believe that once that happens, you are also going to have the same kind of condition, or the condition is going to be transferred to you. So all these misconceptions that they've received from, let's say friends, family, it makes them, how do I say, they stay away from persons who are living with this condition. You can just imagine when you are a group of 5, and then all of a sudden you derive strength from these 4, and then they realize you have epilepsy, and then they all leave you. It feels like the world has come to an end. So yes, social life and epilepsy, it has just proven that with this condition and the perception people have, they make life more difficult for persons who are living with the condition, because they are left alone, no one to care for them. Sometimes they don't even have anyone to talk to. And these kind of messages are transferred to friends, and then they might have a lot of people around them, but you realize that they are just living in their own world. Like I said, sometimes the kind of information we receive from our grandparents concerning the situation, and you have people who belong to the Christendom, where they believe or come from the school of thought that epilepsy is evil. So just like the first presentation, I was just looking at the statement from a patient and what she was saying. And this, for me, it is sad, because I have realized that the kind of thoughts, the kind of teachings that we give to persons who are living with this condition, the kind of motivation we give to them will position their mind to be able to deal with the stigma that is associated with the condition that they are going through. Because I have met a lot of people who are not educated. Okay, their level of education is very, very low. And for that reason, anything they hear about what is happening to them, they take it. And that has affected their growth. So you see that doctors are doing everything they can to make sure that this person gets better. But because their mindset is not even right, they are taking their medication all right, but the mindset is far away from getting better. So each time they go back to the hospital with the same episode, sometimes it's even more. Meanwhile, they are on medication. You keep asking yourself, why is it that this person or patient A is on medication, is not doing fine? Patient C is on medication and is getting better. Sometimes I have realized from my experience that their mindset, and because of this stigma issue, makes healing or they getting better very, very difficult. And when this happens, it means that you are not able to manage the situation. You are not able to manage the seizures. And for professionals like you know that frequency of seizures have a lot of impact on the patient. Aside that, you also talk about jobs. So here in Ghana, we have a lot of people who are living with epilepsy who don't have jobs. They don't have jobs because the one who's supposed to employ him or her has his own mindset and perception about the condition. So he doesn't want to employ someone like that in his or her company. And then a client comes to the office or the company and then sees a member or a staff having seizures, and then that drives them away and they don't want to come there again because the client herself or himself has a perception about what he's saying. So since the employer wants to avoid all these stress, he's not going to employ somebody. Meanwhile, the person living with epilepsy has all the technical know-how for that very position and they can perform well. So without any episode, they are fine, they are doing their work so well. But with this perception, people don't want to employ them. And this still boils down to the stigma. Because if they hadn't been believing the things that they've been hearing, then they wouldn't have sidelined people who are living with the. I think that they are the ones that even need a job because they need to purchase their medication in some instances. They need to feed themselves. They need to live well. So if they don't have a job, how do they get money to really take care of themselves? And this thing leads them back to a whole lot of thinking. And we know what happens when mood swings and all that. The fact that it can trigger seizures and then it doesn't even make them get better and feel okay. So that is one aspect that affects persons who are living with epilepsy. Once stigma step in, no one wants to employ you because everybody is telling everybody that this person has this disease and this kind of people, we cannot associate ourselves with them, we cannot live with them. And then you come back to the big issue here, and that is marriage. So in the world where we live in, we have a lot of people who will not want their family members to marry, whether a male or a female who is living with epilepsy, because they think that this is so stupid. This is an outrageous decision to take for you to marry somebody who is living with that condition. And a lot has changed now. But during the time I got married, I had a lot of oppositions. Okay, I had a lot of oppositions from friends and people, and sometimes they look at you, they look at your mindset, they look at your stand, and they are afraid to tell you that this decision you are taking, we think is not the best decision. But they tell other people and they will say it and you hear. So I heard all those things. But you see, because I was determined to do what I wanted to do, and at that time, I knew Dr. Albert Apalu. So he has given me a lot of insight, a lot of education on what the condition is, because I've made my mind and I've made my intention known to him that I want to marry Francisca, whether epilepsy or no epilepsy. So these were things he taught me that helped me and empowered me, and I took that decision. And after that decision was taken, there has been a lot of challenges. There has been a lot of challenges because of this same stigma, because you find people who try to sideline you because you are married to somebody who is living with epilepsy, or they even sideline the person you are married to. But for me, I would say that I have not really experienced that aspect of people sideline me because I'm married to someone living with epilepsy, because my state of mind and my body language, everything that I do, you dare not try that thing, because you realize that I am on top of the situation and I know what I'm doing. So every angle you come from, I will have an answer for you. But that is how far stigma can affect persons who are living with epilepsy here in my country when it comes to marriage. And even sometimes they will propound this false doctrine that they cannot give birth. So people who are living with epilepsy cannot give birth, because one of the things that I was told before I got married, they said they can't give birth. But like I told you, and Dr. Palu, Dr. Chawefeli knows our children. We have two beautiful daughters, very, very smart. They are even more smarter than other kids that I have come in contact with. So then I asked myself, if you tell me a person living with epilepsy can't give birth to a very smart child, and the fact that if they give birth to a child, the child will also come out with epilepsy, then how can we have this result? So it means that all those things, they are, how do I say, they are fallacy, they are myths, they are things that really doesn't exist. Sometimes even those who are living with the condition themselves, because they've not mastered the act of being strong and standing for themselves, they allow people to stigmatize them because fear. One of the things that even help to trigger seizures easily is fear. And when they go to an environment where they thought that once the people see that they have epilepsy, they will change towards them, their reaction, their behavior towards them will change. So they are afraid. And in the process of doing that, they put pressure on the mind. And before you could say Jack, you realize that the person is having a seizure, the person is on the floor. So yes, stigma is very dangerous. It is very, very dangerous. And for me, one thing I do is that when I meet patients who have the condition, those that I have on my group, those that I speak to, I try to empower them. I try to empower them with the right knowledge as far as epilepsy is concerned. So they should not think about what people are saying. And of course, they can also read. They can also understand. So they can read and understand what is happening. So they know what is happening to them. They understand their situation. They know the things that when they do, it can trigger a seizure. They know the things that when they do, they'll be fine. Once they have all this knowledge, it helps them to be more empowered and take care of themselves. So they go out, they go anywhere, and they are not afraid. They don't really care what is going to happen. Because experience has taught me that sometimes they themselves, they are not very confident. And as a result of that, they even help people to really misunderstand their condition. And it makes life more difficult for them. Some of them even have tried to commit suicide because they realize that they don't belong to this world. As per what the people are doing, they feel that they don't belong to this world and they belong somewhere else. So they need to just take their life and go out. So it will be better than they living and people are treating them as if they are less of a human being. So yes, so far, so good. These are some of the things I want to elaborate on. And going forward, I just want to empower myself in dealing with these aspects of the condition. And like I said, dealing with epilepsy is no more difficult than dealing with the stigma that surrounds it. Because the stigma that surrounds it looks like you are in a circle and you are not getting better and nothing is working. So I've always tried to deal with families who have persons who are living with epilepsy. Because one thing I have seen, and from my experience, the family support is very key. If person living with epilepsy are going to have their family support them, understand their condition, treat them as any other person, and then give them all the needed opportunity that they require to grow and get out of these conditions, even though they are having seizures, but they have minimized seizures and it can be controlled. Once that is done, the person feels more comfortable. And if they are loved and cared for in the home, it is easy to deal with the outside perceptions and then all the wrong arrows that are directed to them. So I think I want to draw the curtains down here, and I want to say that, yes, stigma is deadly, and it is time we declare war on stigma. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. and Mrs. Labi, for very moving and empowering words. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. We are indeed privileged to hear your stories. So without further ado, I'll now welcome Dr. Angelina Kakuza. Dr. Angelina Kakuza is an associate professor of pediatrics and child neurology from Makerere University, and she'll be talking to us on the overview of epilepsy stigma in Africa. Welcome, Prof.
Thank you very much, Chair, for the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. My name is Angelina Kakuza. I am a child neurologist and an associate professor of pediatrics and child health at Makerere University, College of Health Sciences. It gives me great pleasure that I have been given this opportunity to just share with you a brief overview regarding epilepsy and Stigma in Africa. I'll share my screen. The topic that I'm going to talk about is quite familiar to everyone, I hope. It's an overview of epilepsy stigma in Africa. The presentation outline will include a brief introduction, definitions of epilepsy stigma, effects of epilepsy stigma, and possible solutions to reduce epilepsy stigma. These are my disclosures as shown on the slide. Now, epilepsy seems to have affected people since the beginning of recorded history. Based on the Akkadian inscription that was noted in 2000 BC, that is the world's oldest description of an epileptic seizure, was found in Mesopotamian text as shown on the slide. It described a child or a person that was diagnosed as being under the influence of a moon god. So in those days, having epilepsy was like being possessed by a spirit. And therefore, such a person underwent exorcism as a means of treatment. Epilepsy is a disease stigmatized globally and affects people irrespective of age, race, gender, or geography. And sub-Saharan Africa populations, especially the poor populations, bear a disproportionate burden, posing a threat to public health, economic and social development. And there are a number of efforts to reduce stigma towards people with epilepsy in various settings of Africa, and these are underway. When we look at data from the World Health Organization, they estimate that generally the population with active epilepsy at any given time is between 4 to 10 per 1,000 people. And globally, it's estimated that 5 million people are diagnosed with epilepsy every year, with a population burden of about 0.5 with epilepsy. And in high-income countries, they are estimated to be 49 per 100,000 people diagnosed with epilepsy, which is very small compared to what is in low and middle-income countries, estimated as high as 139 per 100,000. When you look at the impact of epilepsy, 50 to 70 million people are living with epilepsy globally, and the majority are found in low and middle-income countries, with a high risk of premature death, up to 3 times higher than for the general population. And people with epilepsy and their families, in addition, suffer from stigma and discrimination. When you look at the myths that are circulating within Africa regarding stigma, in Cameroon, people believe epilepsy is someone being inhabited by the devil. The evil invades them and causes them to convulse from time to time. In Liberia, Zambia, and other African countries, the cause of epilepsy is perceived as related to witchcraft or evil spirits. When you come down to my country in Uganda, there's a myth that somebody gets epilepsy by being invaded by a lizard through witchcraft. When this lizard enters the brain, the movement of the lizard in the patient's head is what is causing the seizures. So when somebody has gotten chronic seizures, repeated seizures, it means that the lizard has overgrown. And many times you find that the traditional healers will refrain from treating such a person because they think or they believe the lizard has overgrown, therefore there is no means for managing that patient. Other myths that fuel stigma in Africa, in rural South Africa, it's referred to as Mafa Avuke, meaning somebody has died and woken up. Definitely no one would want to interact with somebody who has died. There would be fear surrounding that person. And in Uganda, in addition, as in many other African countries, epilepsy is thought to be contagious, So people with epilepsy are not allowed to join communal food plot for fear of contracting, making others contract the epilepsy through that person's saliva. Saliva is not only the only effect or the only fluid that is supposed to be infectious or contagious in a person with epilepsy. There are things like the breath, the blood, the sperm, and genital secretions of people with epilepsy are also considered to be highly contagious. Now, the challenge of epilepsy and stigma is quite high, such that even though epilepsy or the seizures are well controlled with anti-seizure medications, epilepsy presents numerous potential clinical challenges that contribute to the vulnerability of people with epilepsy. And among these include the epilepsy stigma. Epilepsy stigma is considered to be one of the most important factors that have a negative influence with people with epilepsy and may be more harmful on the patient's life than the disease of epilepsy itself. So, what is stigma? Stigma arises from the Latin word stigmat, which means mark or brand, from a Greek word stizen that means to tattoo. The concept of stigma was introduced by Goffman and defined stigma as a distinguishing mark, especially of disgrace or an attribute that is deeply discrediting. Jacobi further explored that concept and distinguished enacted from felt stigma. So what is enacted and felt stigma? Enacted refers to those episodes of discrimination against people with epilepsy solely on the grounds of their social unacceptability and can be from probably excluding them from certain activities like sports, education activities, by virtue of the fact that they have the disease, which makes them candidates not fitting for academic work or position. They can also be fired because of the epilepsy or can be bullied or isolated. While felt stigma refers to the shame associated with living with epilepsy, and the fear of enacted stigma can be a source of anxiety and depression. It initiates a vicious cycle of self-isolation and furthermore leads to various lost opportunities. So in public or enacted stigma, people have a stereotype or a negative belief about a group. For example, they may view them as being dangerous, incompetent, weak, and this prejudice or agreement or belief creates an emotional reaction of anger or fear. People are discriminated, are prejudiced by being avoided, withheld certain things that human rights, in a human rights way, they are entitled to. For example, housing, help, and things like that. With self-stigma or felt stigma, people still also have a stereotype negative belief about themselves. They think they're incompetent. This creates a prejudice or argument or belief that they're actually not worthy. They have low self-esteem, low self-efficacy. And because of that, they tend to have a low opinion of themselves. They fail to pursue work or housing opportunities, thinking that they are not up to it. So what's the background of epilepsy stigma? It's not only a medical diagnosis, but it's also a social label that makes people with epilepsy be perceived as contagious, insane, evil, spiritually possessed, or a target of prejudicial behavior in many spheres of life. And these symptoms, the fact that many times you find some of these symptoms and signs of having epilepsy are not hidden. They are very visible, especially when you have active epilepsy or the ones which are not so subtle. So you find that these seizures tend to make it quite unpredictable for the individual. The person is perceived as being out of control. By losing control of themselves, reverting to primitive acts like bowel or fecal incontinence, the people are viewed as uniquely dangerous and they're thought to be under control of some supernatural power. So stigmatization of people living with epilepsy occurs not only with the individual, but also at an interpersonal, institutional, and community level. This creates misconceptions with the people of the public viewing epilepsy as a mental rather than a physical disease. There's lack of precise information observed, not only among the public and families, but also amongst us, health professionals. It is not surprising to find that even health professionals, some fear to touch the patients with epilepsy, believing that it's contagious. And of course, the misinformation from social media, movies, the internet distorts public perception. And use of stigmatizing language, especially in printed media like epileptics, zontos, fuels the myths and misconceptions and misunderstandings regarding people living with epilepsy. In low and middle income countries, it's estimated that the level of stigma ranges between 31 to 69% and does not only target people with epilepsy, but also their families. Stigma, according to the World Health Organization report, indicates that the experience by the people with epilepsy is more difficult to overcome than the seizures themselves. And the fear of stigmatization prevents people from epilepsy seeking further treatment. So there are other epilepsy stigma manifestations. They may have courtesy or reflected stigma, which affects the whole family members. You find that the family members, even those who are not affected, but just because they have an association with either their sibling or their parent having epilepsy, they have that reflected or courtesy stigma. So you find that sense of shame of either seeing their child or having their parent having epilepsy bestows shame on the whole family as a whole. Then there's anticipated or interpersonal stigma, where fears and expectations of experiencing negative reactions and attitudes from others around them creates the stigma. Institutionalized stigma is a position taken by society through its laws and regulations. For example, in the past, for example, in some countries like in the US, or even we could say in Africa, probably because the literature was not there, but people were not employed or they were not allowed to marry. All of these are institutionalized stigma taken by society through its laws and regulations against people with epilepsy. And I think there are even still some laws, for example, in Tanzania, the chair can further elucidate on that, regarding stigmatizing laws against people with epilepsy. A systematic review done by Kadu Mukasa and colleagues looked at various misconceptions regarding epilepsy in the literature. And these categories were in employment. People with epilepsy are viewed as being mad. They have restrictions and limitations. For example, they should be in separate classes. They should not mix with other people, should not participate in sports. There were misconceptions about the cause and nature of epilepsy. As previously said, it's something to do with fluids from the body, saliva, being demon-possessed. It's a blood disease. And treatment, they should be treated by traditional healers. It's not a curable disease. They have to wear an amulet, which is some sort of like a lucky charm. For first aid, it's important that they can be either they are sacrificed, or sometimes they're told to smell the smoke of a struck match. Other people use sweets during the seizures, sprinkled with olive oil, or place a spoon between the teeth. As you can see, many of these are very dangerous activities. And many times you find that integration into the communities is very, very poor. They object to their being married. They should not play with normal people, normal as in those who don't have epilepsy, and that epilepsy can transmit disease. So all these are just some of the misconceptions prevailing regarding epilepsy in the literature. And when you look at perceptions about epilepsy among traditional healers, more than 2 in 5 would object to their child associating with people with epilepsy or marrying them. Half of them linked epilepsy to madness. More than 2/3 employed dangerous maneuvers such as placing a spoon or cloth in the mouth, tying a person down, putting the head in a toilet hole, or forcing medicines down the throat. So you can see that these traditional healers, much as they would be treating these patients, still feel that they are contagious, they're dangerous to themselves, their children, and would not advocate for normal things that they should be doing. And when you look at perceptions about epilepsy among people with epilepsy, they had a biological explanation. They had a biological explanation of the cause of epilepsy resulting from birth injury, inheritance, and infections. They preferred modern medicine. They preferred modern medicine in managing the epilepsy, and said traditional healers were not helpful. They had concerns about disclosing their illness, difficulties in getting married, and experienced problems in their ongoing marriages. In Uganda, up north, those with epilepsy, there is a belief that epilepsy is a result of witchcraft or curses and therefore cannot be controlled. And many times these factors that fuel the stigma and misconceptions among communities and people with epilepsy is most likely to occur from those who have had no exposure to people with epilepsy. Seeing them for the first time, they get perplexed and they think that probably these people are out of their mind. Those people who have low educational attainment, low socioeconomic status, who are living in rural residences, having farming as an occupation, being males, having poor knowledge of the causes of epilepsy, and those involved in witchcraft practices. All of these factors have been associated, especially in individuals who are more likely to practice stigma against people with epilepsy. So what are the effects of epilepsy stigma? One of them is social isolation. Individuals with epilepsy who face stigma are prone to social isolation. Many times you find they separate utensils that are supposed to be used by everyone in the family. They have a separate utensil for them. They have separate sleeping quarters. That reminds me of a community I visited in rural Uganda, where they put this individual who had epilepsy in their small hut. The individual had their own plate, their own cup, their own spoon. And when you ask how many children are in this household, only those within that community or in that household are counted as children. The other child who is in the separate hut away from the home is not part of the family, and they are often hidden from visitors. A study by Winkler and colleagues noted that epilepsy impacted on the lives of affected people by over 2/3. The people felt that people with epilepsy should not attend school or go to work. People with epilepsy had decreased chances of getting married, and a minority thought that epilepsy was a reason not to have children. Other social effects that have been noted with people with epilepsy is extreme dependence upon their relatives. This dependence interferes with the development of social skills and hampers normal personality development. They tend to be overprotectiveness, especially of the children from life's stressful and potential dangers. And the psychosocial adjustment problems can actually persist from childhood right into adulthood. Having a person with epilepsy, also with stigma, disrupts family life because of the demands for change, and the use of family resources is on the increase, leading to increase in family stress and disruption. There can even be sibling resentment because they see that the parents are paying more attention to the individual with epilepsy compared to themselves. Family is also at risk of poor communication, poor cohesiveness, and poor integration. And the burden of care tends to fall usually on one individual, and that is the mother. She's the member who has been standing in for the child most of the time, and this can lead to resentment and increased family tension. Then there's a lower level of education. This can stem from many things. Parents may view the child's attendance at school as a waste of funds because they think the child is worthless. Parents may even view the child as intellectually weak because of the epilepsy, or they may fear that the child will sustain injury at school, that overprotectiveness, so they don't want the child to go to school. Or the parents may fear being identified to have a child with epilepsy. They had closely kept this secret, but now if this child goes to school, there's a fear that the secret is going to get out of the box. Then the school's refusal to accommodate children for fear of contaminating other pupils, and the parents' fear of the child dying outside home as a result of the seizure. So you find that such children are forbidden from going to school from various reasons, amongst them these that I've portrayed, ending up having lower education compared to their peers. This can also, as an effect of epilepsy stigma, you find that many of the individuals have low self-esteem, underachievement, because they feel in any case, I'm not really worth it. Why should I bother? And this is affecting their day-to-day social life and schoolwork. They also have diminished marriage prospects. Studies done by Kairoki and colleagues noted that adults with active convulsive epilepsy were less likely to be married than the adult controls, and this was significant. However, unmarried adults were similar in either gender and in either type of either generalized or focal epilepsy. Also, stigma can lead to problematic health disorders and lifestyle practices. For example, people, they can get prone to obesity, smoking, drug addiction, and in addition, overeating, eating disorders, bulimia, and they can also, because of the obesity and eating, can have problems with sleep, leading to snoring and hypoxic events. There's also increased rate of psychiatric problems, which may result from the stigma or adverse effects of the anti-epileptic drugs. For example, they are prone to depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and phobias, especially of being afraid of dying during an epileptic attack or seriously harming themselves. So there's need for advocacy to address epilepsy stigma, because advocacy beats stigma. So what is advocacy? Advocacy is to change what is into what should be. Advocacy encompasses the levels of the socio-ecological model, that is at the individual, looking at the attitudes, beliefs, personal history, the relationships between families, partners, peers, and the social group, at the community, in schools, churches, neighborhoods, workplaces, and society, the social policies, the laws, the norms, and cultural norms. So there have been efforts of advocacy in reduction of stigma, which have actually been clearly marked out in the IGAP program with specific points for the member states. But here I'll just give a summary where we need to raise awareness and better public understanding of epilepsy and other related neurological disorders. And these initiatives improve the inclusion of affected persons. We need to focus on reaching the most vulnerable population groups, that is children, women, older people, those living in poverty and emergency situations, and then address disparities specific to each national context. We also need to have efforts, innovative strategies that strengthen international efforts and national leadership to support policies and laws for people with epilepsy. And such strategies contribute to improving public attitudes and reducing stigma. We need to empower people with epilepsy, that goes without saying, and that is why we believe that we need to have as many people involved, organizations, civil society groups. All of these are involved in the policy, the planning, the legislation, service provision, monitoring, and research in epilepsy. So in conclusion, epilepsy stigma is indeed a burden, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but globally. Epilepsy stigma in sub-Saharan Africa is still understudied and may be more harmful than the epilepsy itself. It's important that we destigmatize these individuals and improve their quality of life. And as health professionals, we have to be aware of the situation, identify and manage it in our diverse specialties. Thank you very much for listening. I will be available for a few questions after this. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Angelina, for a beautiful talk, a very beautiful overview of epilepsy stigma in Africa. And now the talks are open for questions and comments. So please, if you have any question, put them in the chat and I'll read them to the speakers. So we already have 2 questions. One from Adam Jallo Jane, I think from Gambia. So the first question is, did culture impact any of the patients interviewed? I'm an epilepsy advocate in the Gambia. And they recently came across where people with epilepsy want to come to their clinic, but the parents will not allow the patients, and she didn't want to go against their parents' wishes. So I think this may go to, I don't know, Sloan or Angelina.
Well, I can start. Yes, I mean, one of the, I think, interesting things we find with the oral history work is the nuance within some of the stories about, you know, the big picture, stigma, and whether or not you disclose and how you might seek medical treatment. For instance, similar to the example the participant just mentioned, we've had people in interviews talk about the idea of their community wanting them to go, for instance, to a traditional healer. And that was actually a kind of very strong push. But they said, well, but I don't believe in that. I'm a Christian and I want to go to church and I know people will pray for me. And so, you know, I think it's very important in the literature, particularly perhaps if you're reading it maybe from outside of Africa, for instance, where you might have your own misconceptions about, well, everyone only believes one thing. And the thing they believe is really kind of simple. We can just say, oh, it's all just witchcraft. Those ideas may be deeply embedded in many communities, but there are still people's stories that show the detail where someone will say, I don't believe that, I believe this, and my story is important. So I think that's sort of where we see the kind of all kinds of cultures sort of coming out in nuance, whether it's the culture within one family or a culture within one community or a much broader kind of regional look at how people kind of interact with their beliefs.
Thank you so much. I think this one goes to Angelina. It says, where would you discuss structural stigma? Again, from Adam Jallo from Gambia. He says his brother has epilepsy and his parents had to make a difficult decision to stop him from going to school at an early age. And many children are in the same position due to lack of support from the school. The school structures in most African countries allow this to happen. Angelina, can you respond to that?
Okay. Thank you very much, Adam, for the question. You've termed it as structural stigma, but excuse me, I don't think the term structural stigma exists, but I think what you were trying to explain is that in this institution, there are probably challenges in terms of accommodating these children. Sometimes it stems from the school, other times it stems from the parents. Now, in this situation, when you say that the parents had to make a difficult decision, most likely the parents had tried to take the child to the school, but probably there was no support. And this child probably was feeling stressed, did not want to go to school. And the teachers themselves felt not empowered to take care of these patients, as is quite common, even in the country where I live in. Many of the teachers are not aware how they manage these patients. So they find it a bit difficult. So probably they asked the parent to maybe leave the child behind because they felt inadequate to manage such a child. So they had to make that painful decision. But all this stems from the fact that if we don't empower the community by raising awareness of what epilepsy is and what it is not, they'll continue to fear patients with epilepsy. They'll not know how to manage them. They'll not know what to do when a patient has epilepsy. And because of that ignorance and fear coupled with myths, they would rather tell the parents, take the child away and don't bring the child. And the parents themselves, the felt stigma that they may be feeling, and also knowing that the child will not be welcome at school, will withdraw the child. And you find many of these children, as I mentioned in the slides, will have low education because of all those fears. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Angelina. Please post your questions in the chat and we'll read them aloud. I don't see any more questions. Okay, there's one question from, just says iPhone. This goes to Mr. and Mrs. Labi. Have you seen progress in the area of stigma reduction? I think they mean from your work that you've been doing. Have you seen any progress?
So, yes, I have seen. Okay, and it said charity begins at home. So I will start recounting from home. I remember when we got married, my wife, is difficult for her to go out alone. And all because of these things happening and no one is there to help you and you don't know what you're about, you don't know what to do to help yourself. And then aside that, there were people who felt that the decision I have taken is wrong to marry somebody who have epilepsy. So their behavior from the beginning was a bit weird. But you see, gradually as my wife got to know more about what is happening to her, we ourselves, we learned together about it. I teach her the things that I learned, or any seminar I attend and whatever I get, I make sure she's also enlightened about what is happening to her. From there, a lot of things change. So it changes the mindset. That's why in my talk, I talked about the fact that the mindset is very important. Okay, the mindset is very important. How you feel about yourself. And I love the presentation given by Madam Angelina. It's perfect. Okay, it's perfect. That is what I did is a summarization. What she did is an elaborate, and I love it. So if you don't feel confident about yourself, come on, it can't work. And I can tell you now, there has been a lot of change as far as the stigma is concerned. You know, at this point, we really don't care who doesn't feel good about the condition. We don't really care. Okay, when it used to be a problem for you, it becomes a burden, and then you are afraid to go here, you're afraid to go there. Now we don't really care. We don't care. What we care about is empowering other people, including those who don't even have the condition, but they don't know what the condition is all about. And for that reason, they are stigmatizing others who have it. So yes, there have been a vast improvement. In fact, these are part of the encouragement why we can't stop what we are doing. Yeah, because there has been a lot of changes, not just for my wife, but I know other people. There was a lady, we more like literally adopted her as our own. And we were encouraging her, we were teaching her. She's married now. She now has 2 children. There is another lady who also had issues with job and all that. And we have to encourage her and teach her from that stigma aspect. She is also working now. She also has a child. So yes, we won't talk about the successes as far as stigma is concerned on what we're doing here. We've chopped a lot of successes, but I believe that there's room for improvement. So we are not stopping because there are more people who need to hear this and then get out of their self, low esteem and isolating themselves. Once you are able to do it, you see, in my country, in my tribe, there is this act that is normally done when you have a quarrel with someone and you know that your eyes is not good or your eyes are not good, you can't see well, and you know your opponent is going to insult you with your eyes. You start by insulting your eyes first. once you insult your eyes, your opponent doesn't have any weapon against you. Are you getting the point? So then you can deal with your opponent. So we are looking at it from that angle where you understand yourself and what is happening to you. And once you stand on your feet, no one can stigmatize you. So yes, there has been a lot of progress in that direction.
Thank you so much, Mr. Labi, for very inspiring words. I don't see any other questions. So there's one small announcement to everyone. The Global Health in Epilepsy Project database provides so the Global Health in Epilepsy database provides a registry for existing epilepsy projects throughout Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, as well as in other regions. It identifies information such as project location, institutional partners, project scope, funding sources, and volunteer needs. The database is quick and easy to complete. By submitting the information on your project, you inform understanding of efforts that are occurring throughout the world to narrow the epilepsy treatment gap. The database will provide you an opportunity to learn from others and to explore collaboration opportunities that might strengthen your own work as well as that of the sector. Furthermore, the database will allow people from different areas such as the government, academia, nonprofit, or philanthropy to learn about existing efforts while offering a means to engage. On the next slide, please scan the QR code to receive your certificate. Also, there's a link in the chat box right now to get your certificate. Yes, so I think there are no further questions. So I'd like to take this opportunity once again to thank our speakers, Dr. Sloan Mahon, Mr. and Mrs. Labi, as well as Dr. Angelina Kakuza for fantastic talks. And again, I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who took their time and listened and participated in this very interesting talk, which is the last EpiSkills sessions of the ILAE Africa for 2023. So I'd like to take this opportunity to wish everyone happy holidays and enjoy the rest of the year. Thank you very much and have a good night.